Hi, welcome back to DevIbs. Next up, we have Lydia Peabody talking about her experiences with Jupyter Notebook. Lydia is a data wrangler who brings a diverse background to understanding what numbers tell us about the world. She joined the data and analytics team at Neighborlytics after completing a data science bootcamp last year. Remember last year? Prior to that, she provided training and coaching for data-driven change in STEM education and led rock climbing and kayaking adventures for people of diverse backgrounds and abilities, among other bits and pieces. Please feel free to ask questions in chat. We'll collate them after. And yeah, looking forward to this. Take it away, Lydia.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Oren. I am excited to be here today talking about what I have learned over the past almost a year now that I have spent working professionally with Python and data, and particularly with Jupyter Notebooks. And one of the things I have learned is that having only one tool can land you in some tricky spots. And there are times when suddenly I find that maybe my Jupyter Notebook is not quite doing everything I want it to do. So as Oren mentioned, how did I get to this cliff? Well, I used to spend a lot of time playing outside with people and kids and helping them abseil off a cliff and climb back up, which was a lot of fun, but I really enjoy technical problem solving and math, which does exist in rock climbing, but not as much as I would like. So I chose to do a data science bootcamp. And that was fantastic. I learned a ton. There's so many things I could do at the end of it that I could not do at the start, but it was taught exclusively using Jupyter Notebooks. Fantastic for lots and lots of things in data science, even in the more advanced world of AI and machine learning. Lots of work gets done in notebooks. But when I landed at Neighborlytics, which was where I'm working now as a data engineer, I wasn't really doing a lot of the machine learning type things that the bootcamp focuses on. I was doing ETL, extract, transform, load. I was creating pipelines, doing data engineering for these pipelines for our data to be able to be brought in, organized in the way we wanted it, and spit back out again. And in pieces, Jupyter Notebooks were still a fantastic way of doing that, but not always. So for a little bit of context, I see this as a really common theme in the industry at the moment, that there are lots of people from different backgrounds who are either changing industries or just coming out of some of the new courses that are developed at university, who are doing a lot of their learning of Python through Jupyter Notebooks. And for anyone who's not familiar with notebooks, which I'm guessing is uncommon, but just in case, this is what an interactive Python notebook looks like. And what it lets you do, as you can see there, there's little cells, and you can write individual or as many lines of code as you want in each of those cells and just run those one at a time. So it's great for learning because it gets you immediate feedback. Did that line of code that I write actually mean anything? Was it correct and accurate? And can I get anything out of it? And it lets you see immediate results, which is part of why it's great for data science, is when you're trying to figure things out and understand what's there, you very quickly get to see what's happening, look at it, understand, visualize. You can throw maps and charts and all sorts of different things directly into these. So the idea is that they let us do genuine experiments with Python. So as with a real lab notebook, that means we can document as we go our process, we can show our results, we can provide visualizations and analysis. Used well, notebooks become this great explanatory storytelling sharing tool that helps data science be like other sciences, where we have trackability, we have transparency and trackability in our process, and therefore better opportunities for reproducibility and good solid conversation around results. But then when that's all you've learned, tool that's really designed for this sort of interactive communication, learning, investigation, but that's not always what you're doing, that flexibility only goes so far. So a Jupyter Notebook can serve as just about, in this case, I'm saying I need a wrench. It might serve as lots of different types of wrench. And it's really good for that. I mean, for me, it gives you a great way to get into it. And you can do a lot of different things with it. But there's just times where maybe you come across a project where what you actually need to do is pound in a nail, not turn something. And that's where I found I started to have some challenges, that running things in a notebook can be slower, in some cases quite dramatically slower than running them through a Python script or in some other format. And they also do a lot of background things that you're not necessarily seeing. They can hold a lot of things in memory, save a lot of things for you. And I know from working with my own work and others coming through similar learning processes, there's a habit of leaving your notebooks open and having like 500 notebooks open at the same time while working on different things, which can create a variety of different problems that I know I was not made aware of as part of my training. It was sort of all about just learn how to use this, learn how to write the code, not necessarily learn about the tool itself and what are some of the challenges. So I'm going to start off by looking at a few of the different ways that this can get us into trouble. And then as we go, provide some basic tips and strategies around what are some of the things that I've learned to do a little bit differently, or ways that I've modified what I'm doing that just help both keep the notebook as a really strong tool and also help me use my grounding and comfort with notebooks as a jumping off point, as a springboard to be able to learn some other development techniques as well. Because that I think is a piece that wasn't at all clear to me coming in, is how can I use this place that I am comfortable to start increasing my skill and developing in other ways that I'm less comfortable with. So some of the issues we can run into, the first is unintended calculations. And this is a little video that'll run you through how I get the wrong answer when subtracting in a notebook. And I said, 5 minus 6 is minus 1. That's great. I'm then thinking about, well, maybe I want to think about some other variables. I want to look at 7, 8, 10. Nope, that first one is what I wanted. I'm going to save it so I can use it later. But now suddenly when I subtract, I get a different value. How did that happen? Well, because further along the line, I changed what B represented. And that is silly in this example, but actually I do things like this all the time, repeatedly, where I'm thinking through what value makes sense for this, what do I want to do with this? And at some point, I change the name of something and then run something different, because in a notebook, I'm allowed to go back to things and relook at them and reevaluate, which can be really handy, but also is a great way to get myself in trouble. So this is one that has some really simple solutions, but is also a really common, when I'm just exploring and playing around and trying to figure out what I'm writing, it's a real danger of this going back, changing something, and then rerunning something else and not realizing that I'd changed one of my inputs in the meantime. Another related example that is around the same idea of what is this notebook holding in memory that I'm not always seeing. Let's say that I created this video and I'm like, no, I always want this to be a little bit higher. I'm going to change my input to Z so that it adds 40 rather than adding 10. And now I'll rerun, but wait, my output didn't change. And I can force that to happen if I'm smarter. So now when I do the restart and run all option, I get an error, and I can clearly see my problem is, although I changed my function, I never actually switched to using that updated function. And in my brain, I'm like, hey, that function no longer exists. I got rid of that function. It's not in my notebook. I deleted it. But because of the way the interactive notebook works on the kernel structure, which I'm not going to pretend I know all the technical background of, but part of what it does is it holds all of the calculations you've done in memory for you until you change them, until you restart, until you clear them. And so that means that things that, from my perspective, I've deleted, I've gotten rid of, unless I actually go through the active step of telling the kernel to restart and forget that as well, that it's hard to get rid of. The challenge with that is that I can't selectively say, just get rid of this thing. I can redefine it as something new, but I can't actually pick and choose which things are and are not staying in memory. From this is kind of the idea that this idea of namespace pollution, of what's floating around my environment that might cause problems for me, is certainly not unique to notebooks. but because of the way notebooks allow you to operate, it tends to cause a lot more problems in this space. So my number one tip that I can't believe I got through a 3-month boot camp using notebooks every day with no one ever telling me is to keep calm, restart, and run all. That big red button that kind of makes you look like, oh my God, do you really want to push this button? Absolutely, yes, you do want to push the button. That just clears everything in memory. It makes sure it gets rid of both of the types of problems we were looking at there, where if you've run something out of order and that's confused your calculation, if you're doing a restart and run all, now everything is forced to run in order. It will therefore calculate visually the way you think it's doing, and it will pick up any of those errors where you've actually changed something, you're now creating something out of order, you've introduced something that you hadn't realized you're actually using before you've introduced it, all those different pieces. And when you're learning to progress, I know I've worked with a number of people recently who are just coming into this and do frequently write code and run code one line at a time, which is a habit that notebooks tend to encourage, which isn't helpful in that it can create these sort of errors. So my other immediate recommendation is to bunch your code. And all I mean by that, sure, maybe it's a good idea to look at getting it into a function eventually, but first just think about what are the pieces that I'm doing that are one thing? Because even if you're progressing on and learning how to write things into functions, that's the first step you're going to need to be able to identify. Which of these things go together and are doing the single thing I want? Stick them all in one cell, because then they always have to run together. And that just helps clean things up a little bit. It's a very simple step to start taking to move towards a more consistent style of programming. The second tip I have, again, is not unique to notebooks, but use your eyeballs and your brain a lot. When you are changing things, sometimes with those things that are saved in memory, it's not immediately obvious why you're getting an error and where you changed something that you're not spotting. So you really need to slow down and review your code. One thing I find when someone asks me, hey, can you do an analysis of this thing and give me a CSV output, is I'm like, oh, this is just background. It's just for me. I'll just kind of run it. Oh, that's not what I want. I'll go back and change these things. And the thing to remember is if it's not clear to me, it's never going to be useful to anyone else, because they're going to come back to me with questions of how did you get to this? I'm not going to have a clue. So that's one of the main things to do, is if you're getting weird errors, if you're not sure what's happening, really focus on looking at what you're doing, adding your markdown, adding your functions, adding your comments, so that you know what's happening. Because once it's clear to you, you're going to have a lot easier time troubleshooting and keeping things neat. Which brings me to the next thing that occasionally caused me problems is, wait, someone else wants to look at what I'm doing? Oh no, I've just been working on my own projects. So maybe someone wants a CSV that just tells them some counts of things. This is bike share data, and count was not a super useful thing to look at because they're all the same, but it just gives us some sample data. I'm thinking, all right, the people I'm working with are used to Excel pivot tables. They're going to like it in this format. It looks like a pivot table. They'll know what it means. Wait a minute. When I save that to CSV, it looks slightly different. Like it's clearly the same data, but is that going to be as accessible to them? They'll probably figure it out. But just so that when we're reviewing, when they come back with questions, we're all on the same page, I'll reformat my data so it looks the same, so that we can all be consistent. Just to be safe though, I'll re-export this. Wait a minute. Yet again, when I export it, it looks slightly different. So this is just one of the things to be aware of. And certainly there's ways to control this. In this particular case, you can just tell it not to export this index. But just be aware that what you see in your notebook is not always what gets outputted to a file when you're doing file outputs. And that's something to be really aware of. Because if you hand someone who's not a super technical person an Excel file that has a random column of numbers with no name, they're probably going to come back and be like, what on earth is this? Maybe they'll get used to it if you do it a lot, but just avoiding these kind of little things where what's in your notebook is different from what comes out can help your process be a lot smoother further on. The other thing that most often wants to be shared with others are visualizations. So in my notebook, I can make these great interactive maps, I can make charts, I can make all sorts of pretty things. And often those are what someone else in the organization wants. They want to be able to look at them so that they can play with that map and see different variations of it and decide what might be most useful for a client. They want to be able to better understand the data, and using this visualization makes it far easier to interpret and work with. But I can't just hand them my notebook because they're not people who work with code and have their environment set up to be able to run a notebook. So how do I learn to help them? And again, it cracks me up. I think that when I asked this question, when I was even just creating slides and outputs of projects when I was training, I often got either just like right click and save as, or just take a screenshot, which is not maybe the most effective process when what you're doing is generating 20 maps for a report in different variations. You'd like to be able to have a built-in way of doing this, which obviously exists for most packages. And in addition to these being good ways of just being able to output and share that information so that it's consistent and you know exactly what you're providing people, this also helps with one of the problems I see, which is when I get a lot of visualizations into my notebooks, they start to get really, really slow. They're slow to load, they're slow to open. I've gotten them to the point that they actually crash and refuse to open approximately 50% of the time, depending on what else my computer is doing. And so that idea of notebooks get you into the habit of like printing out things and looking at them, but there's an important point of needing to clean that up so that you're not dragging down and bogging down your notebook with stuff. Once you've checked something, get it out again. And if you're at the point that you're producing these for others, not for yourself, don't even bother with that line where you're showing it in your notebook. Just write it. And if you want to verify that it's outputting exactly what you wanted it to output, that this is in Plotly Express, you can use auto open equals true, and it just pops up in a separate tab. It opens the HTML file for you. That's sort of an unnecessary step once you're used to it, but it sort of keeps that same speed of being able to immediately review, but also have that piece of minimizing what's in your notebook. So I think they're really great tools for these visualizations. That's one of the strengths, but it's also where when they get more complex, when you get a lot of data, when you're doing a lot of variations for people to be able to understand a business problem, they get really slow and bogged down, and that can be a problem. So again, restart and run all. Make sure you're outputting what you think you're outputting. Clean as you go. One thing to think about is your printouts. Don't just look at your data because you're looking at your data and want to make sure you know what's in it. Think of it like a log. What do you actually want to know? Rather than printing the actual map every time you're outputting in a map, maybe just write a line saying, wrote file to this location with this map. And that then gives you a record of what you've done to make sure you're following what you've done without it being a lot of excess process. So that print for value, keep things moving. But sometimes things still work a lot better. There's some problems, particularly when you're transitioning into the rest of the business using some of your code. Maybe it's time to actually think about how can I incorporate some Python scripts instead of always writing in notebooks. That presents some challenges I wasn't expecting. The first one being the Python main function structure, which I had no awareness of whatsoever. My thought, I need to write a Python script. I can write a Python script with a function called subtraction. I should just be able to call that, right? There must be a way to get that out of there. But what I actually have to do is write this awkward main thing and then put everything inside. And then how do I even get X and Y into that? All of this is pretty simple, but at the same time, to someone who is new to it, it's a lot to pick up at once, and none of it is intuitive. So certainly there's ways to get those inputs in, but what on earth is sys.argv? I don't know, something Google told me put stuff in. And I do know a little bit more about it now, but it's just, what I'm trying to get across is to appreciate that when people come in, it can be hard to make this transition, and it's harder than it seems like it should be. So there are some strategies for how can we reuse functions, how can we create these scripts in ways that actually still let us stay a little bit more in leveraging that comfort of working within a notebook. So here's an example where I now have this Python file of subtraction, and it's just sitting right next to my notebook that I'm calling, so that the two are in the same folder together. And I can then call that function from that other file and do my subtraction. And maybe I want to organize my stuff a little bit more, so I want my notebook by itself, and my function files can go into a different spot. So, oh no, wait, I can't get to it anymore, except that all I have to do is tell it where to find it. And this is something that my understanding was you're supposed to need a init.py to be able to call things from other folders, but apparently that's not true when using Notebook / again, this is one of those pieces that's a little bit mysterious about how does this work. And this was a trick because I can still run that because it's in memory, even though it should give me an error. So you get the idea, like we can pop these into folders as long as our notebook is at the same level, or our script file is at the same level or directly below our notebook. And we can also set it up so that if you want a little bit more structure, this is the one I like, where I can keep my notebooks in one folder, and then I can keep functions that are related to each other structured in other places, so that I start to be able to get to that. But wait, how do I call that now? They're not below my folder. So what I learned is that where the path that Python searches around for functions is actually for modules is actually in that sys.path variable, which is just a list. So I can just append additional things to that list to say, hey, go look for stuff here and see if you find it. And that then gives me a lot of flexibility to be able to call scripts from notebooks. And I can now set up my notebook as a controller for my projects. So if I get weather data for all of my projects, I can create a function that gets weather data. I know what arguments I need, and I can come into my notebook where I can see those really clearly and put that in and get it to collect this weather data for me, and use this as a way of essentially doing sort of a project control. So those are some of my tips for really how to start using scripts, are to think about this piece of how can I call my scripts from my notebook. And this auto reload extension is super handy when you're testing, because it lets you change the script you're using without actually needing to restart and re-import that script or that function, as long as you don't change the name of it. And then it also gives you the opportunity to use your commits as a record. So rather than creating a copy of your notebook saying, Melbourne weather collection, that can just be your commit message and you're good to go. So some last tips, again, always restart and run all unless you have too much data, and then I'll let you get away with the run all below button. Be kind to yourself. We're all always learning. And if you are a really experienced developer, be kind to others. Look for where notebooks are actually adding value and how people who are notebook trained, who are coming into your organization, which is happening more and more, can help support what you're doing. And maybe where they might even be an interesting technique for you to use. Try one thing at a time. So there's lots of different ways to move from working fully in notebooks to all sorts of other spheres. Just practice one thing and do whatever works for the rest. As long as you get to the right point, it's a starting point. We're all learning. Always assume you'll need this in the future. The number of times I've been burned because someone says, can you do this one-off analysis for you so I don't think about cleaning it up, and I make it really ugly, and then 2 weeks later they say, hey, can we do that for another client? Yeah, I guess so. Focus on quality and consistency. Again, kind of goes with that. And let things go. You're not going to get everything right to begin with, and that's totally fine. The point is to keep trying things, keep learning, move on. So enjoy your notebooks. Hit me up. I am not a frequent social media user, but I try. And Neighborlytics is hiring at the moment. So if you want to come play with some social data to make the world have more interesting, better, healthier cities, talk to me about that as well. Thanks a lot.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Lydia. That really good
Thank you so
talk.
much, yeah.
Love that. We've had heaps of questions in the chat as well. We are running close to time, but we're going into a break after this, and it's a nice long lunch break. So I would actually really like to grab a couple of questions. So if we could do that, that'd be cool. Orion, did you want to? I think you had a question you wanted to throw with first.
Sure. So I think you touched on this a little bit, but like I guess the first question I would have is like, what were the indicators that you had actually started to really outgrow Jupyter as the tool you were using?
Great question. And I'm gonna critique the question slightly in that I don't think it's me outgrowing Jupyter. I think it's specific projects that Jupyter will always have a place if I'm working in data. A lot of the things, though, that made me realize I needed a better option, certainly one is speed, that there were things I was doing that when I realized how much faster they ran outside of my notebook, it was insane. When I started writing things that the goal was for other people to be able to use them was really the biggest one, though. That this is not just about me being able to create analysis, it's about something that my company wants to be able to reuse in other spaces to build into our infrastructure. Then I need to be able to test and design that in a way that in the future, a dev or an engineer can take that and wrap it into a piece of a larger system more easily.
There's also a question to see if you've got any thoughts on using regular notebooks compared to Jupyter Lab. Have you used Jupyter Lab at all?
I don't. I haven't used Jupyter Lab. I know there's lots of cool options out there. I know lots of people who love Colab. I also have looked at one called DeepNote a little bit, which is really focused around collaboration. So I'd be very interested to hear more in some of the hallways or wherever about other people's perspectives on that.
Cool, because there's also a link to a project called NBDev, I think. Someone's put a link in the chat there. Again, I'm not sure if you've used it and can comment, but yeah, it's in the chat. So do jump into the chat, everyone, if you've got some questions around this, and Lydia will be around to answer that.
Absolutely.
Orion, did you grab any other ones?
So two more that I've got.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one, kind of like following on from the first question about like those indicators of projects outgrowing, is how do you transition? How do you build those sort of ways of sharing the software with engineers or devs or with other people?
Great question. I would say the number one thing is find yourself a mentor. I was super lucky at Neighborlytics to have Gala to support me, but find a resource that you can go to that is something a little bit beyond Stack Overflow where you can get answers to questions. The quickest starting point is going to be you need to write functions or classes. You need to start using objects for your code so that they can be reused by others and they can be called in some sort of way. So it's learning what are those basic structures to start with. They can be really ugly functions, doesn't matter. But just starting with that, how do I put more structure around my code so that it is easier to call in some other way rather than just being run as an independent line of code.
Awesome. That's been really, really good. Thank you so much for coming along and like submitting to this inaugural track, sharing your knowledge. It's been very cool. Orion, do you have any final words?
Oh, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. And again, thank you for being a part of Devos and sharing your journey. It's been really lovely hearing you talk. Thank you.
Fantastic. Glad to be here.
So